I am prepared to become the Death Knight guy. I am prepared to be the YouTube channel or the person that you go to if you want to learn about anything Death Knight. So in order to prove this, I have 20 ready deck lists that are available both in Standard and in Wild. So if you guys are wanting a Death Knight deck, I have plenty of options for you. So let's just go ahead and dive right into these because there are a lot of different things we gotta say in this video. Before we get started, I would just like to tell you guys about the Death Knight Discord that I am starting to amass. The link will be down in the description below, but pretty much we're going to be using that Discord to discuss decks, to discuss synergies, but it's also going to be the place that we're going to be keeping track of who is going to be the first person to get 1,000 wins. As you guys know, I'm very dedicated to this goal, but I'm gonna see if there's other people that might try to beat me during this. So if you guys think that you can beat me, feel free to join the Discord server, or if you just want to get some deck lists, it'll be a great resource. A great resource to take advantage of. But regardless, let's go ahead and take a look at the first deck out of the 20 decks that I have made. I made about like 12 of these, and I needed to pick some other decks as I was creating this video, but these are finalized lists. These are not decks that I played during the Theorycraft stream 100%. They are the same ideas, but these are updated lists that I will be going into the first day to see which ones work and which ones don't. And the first decks that we're going to be going over right now are triple frost rune decks because I believe they are going to be the most powerful. Now this one is a little bit more of a, I don't want to say a meme, but it's like a different way of building the combo deck. But I wanted to try and make a deck work with Bone Lord, and Bone Lord is actually like a great way to utilize like spell damage in Standard because there is a way to set up a combo with like Guild Trader and Glacial Advances before you even play Bone Lord. So this is more of like a high roll possibility in case you need to do 2 Guild Traders along with all of your spells in order to make the combo work, depending on what the meta is. This could easily change depending on what we see during the first day, but if like 40 HP, 50 HP is something we got to deal with, then we're probably going to need that reach with the Guild Trader. But something else that I really want to point out, and this is going to be common throughout a lot of my Triple Frost decks, is that Lady Death Whisper into Drakarian Bomber is actually a combo I did not see almost anybody else try out during the the theory crafting stream and during any other streams that I've seen with Death Knight so far. So I think that this is a combo that really needs to be looked at with Triple Frost because it gives you insane capabilities of being able to turn 4 damage into 16 damage, and in some cases you just want that burst, other cases you need to build it up in order to beat the Renethal decks and whatnot. So I believe that this has a lot of flexes to where, you know, it could be really useful in order to copy certain kinds of Frost cards. But you also have other undead minions in the deck, like Harbinger of Winter, for example. So it's not like Drakarian Bomber is only going to go with Lady Death Whisper. But if you have Lady Death Whisper, I don't understand why we don't have this in order to give that potential because it's extremely powerful. The rest of this deck is pretty straightforward, honestly. Like, I'm going to tell you right now, every single deck has Astalor. Craft this card immediately when you get it. It is going to be the best card that you can possibly get from this expansion. I think it's just going to be the best card. There's just really nothing more to say about it. When you combo it with Bran, you have ridiculous capabilities. And we'll get to this later on, but Astalor with Bran is actually very easy to take advantage of in the triple Frost Rune, double Frost Rune Death Knight archetype. But this is pretty straightforward. Just draw cards, do the combo, and hope that your opponent can't disrupt it. And I will tell you right now, there's a lot of school teachers in this deck, but let's see the other ways the triple Frost Rune decks can be built. This next triple Frost Rune deck is actually a deck that utilizes the Frostworm theories, but this is going to be in a 30-card deck versus in the next deck, I believe, is going to be the 40-card version of this. But I actually did lose to this deck once during the Theorycraft stream, and I'm not sure exactly what the best way to build it is, but the guy that I was fighting ended up playing a lot of the early game cards, a lot of the 1-drops. I can't think of the names right now, but cards like I can't even pronounce this, but the Yagimir Frostbreaker. Can't even see it on the screen right now, unfortunately, because of how I have my screen set up. But regardless, I'm not sure if like these early game tempo cards are going to be the way to build the deck. I feel like the only way to really tempo is to try and stick a board or to get value out of your cards in some way. And honestly, I guess tempo is kind of the wrong way to describe this deck because it does have ways that it just wants to stall the game. It doesn't really want to play anything. But the reason why I'm calling it tempo is because you need to be actively playing your cards, because if you decide to go for the Lady Death Whisper Drakari combo, then you can easily copy up to 8 Frostworm Furies. I cannot tell you a single deck that isn't a combo deck that is going to be able to survive 8 Frostworm Furies, okay? So I'm really concerned about Frost Death Knight being like overbearingly powerful in Standard, which is why I've made so many decks around the archetype. But it's just like the best way to, I feel like, to utilize this particular build of the deck if we're going for 30 cards. I feel like this does work for 30 cards a little bit more because you have more consistency. But survivability is the main reason why a lot of people might try Renathal first, just because, you know, 40 HP is also more enticing. You get to play more cards. But if card count really does matter and combo isn't something that we're all too worried about, then we might be able to throw out this version of the deck that is just aimed towards just board locking as many times as possible. You have school teachers as well as Bran in order to somehow cheat something. And I will tell you guys right now, Bran into double Horn of Winter into school teacher is going to be core for a lot of the double Frost Rune decks, because this is just such a powerful combo. And when you can also play Queen in addition to all of that, there's just a lot of like tempo, nutty tempo moves you can do with this style of deck. But the rest of the deck, it has support like removal. I don't know how good Remorseless Winter is going to be. It's very dependent on the meta, which is why a lot of my decks don't run this. But in this kind of deck, it makes sense because you draw and you clear, so you have that survivability as well as drawing your combo. I think this deck is honestly very, very good. It might be very close to the deck that we see that rules the meta if Death Knights are on top. But Renathal is something else that a lot of people are still keeping their eyes on, and you still can make this style of deck with Renathal. So what exactly does that look like? And no, it is not the Meati deck. I tried my best in order to not just copy Meati, so here's my version of what Renathal might look like. And here it is. Here's the Renathal build. It's very, very similar, except it has a few differences. Like, for example, it's got the Spammy Arcanist, which is probably going to be one of the best cards for Death Knight, especially if you have, like, Reborn minions being very common. Suddenly, Spammy Arcanist stonks just go massively up. But there's something else going in this deck, and yes, I hate to admit, it is Sire Denathrius. However, there is a massive high roll in this deck that a lot of people may not be considering, because something that I was thinking about was, what if we really need Brandon to Sire Denathrius? Can we possibly make that happen? Some of you are already noticing the Kael'thas, but you're not thinking deep enough. Bone Lord Frost Whisper. There's actually something that you can do that's ridiculously powerful if you have like the perfect world situation. So in Christmas Land, as they like to say in Magic the Gathering, in Christmas Land, the perfect combo would be you have Sire Denathrius, that's like, you know, let's just say 20 damage. So you play the Bone Lord, and then you have a 0 mana Kael'thas, okay? 0 mana Kael'thas. Now the gears are starting to turn. You play that, you play Bran, and then you can do quite literally anything else in order to help you clear the board. But like, you have plenty of death rattles that can maybe do something, like if you get lucky off a school teacher. But the overall point is that you have Kael'thas into Bran into Sire Denathrius for literally 3 mana. For 3 mana. You thought 10 mana was a problem? No, for 3 mana. So you have 7 mana for flex to just kill the board or do something to make sure that your Sire Denathrius is going to kill your opponent. And I think that that is absolutely worth mentioning, because almost nobody has talked about this yet except somebody in Twitch chat. I forget who told me about this synergy, but good ever-living God, it looks scary as hell. So yeah, I would say that this deck is probably going to be one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful. But I really don't want Sire Denathrius to be that good, in all honesty. I want other cards to get their time to light. But if Sire Denathrius is on top, this is probably going to be the deck for Death Knight. Looking at some other non-Renathal, non-Sire Denathrius decks, I have another version of this tempo. It's more aggressive and more actually tempo-based than the other decks. But one thing that I really want to point out, again, Lady Death Whisper into Drakarian Bomber is so freaking good that you can fit it into almost any style of these decks and it'll just make sense. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to make several copies of either Howling Blast or specifically Glacial Advance. We want Glacial Advance because if you think about it, if you have 8 of these cards, you can literally play them. You have to play 7, right? No, you can actually play all 8. You can play all 8 because you have 3 plus the other 7 that are 1 mana. So how much damage is that? That's 32. 32? Yeah, it's 32 damage. 8 times 4. I can't do basic math, but I can apparently build these decks with the right idea in mind. But regardless, like, this is like an easier way of being able to go about this combo because you actually have minions that are threatening. You don't need the full combo, but you still have like, you know, 16 plus an additional 6 that you can get off of these, depending on how you discount or how you build up your combo. This deck actually doesn't discount. I'm sorry for misspeaking. There's another deck that runs the weapon, but I thought that this deck didn't need the weapon, except the early game weapon just for early game removal, because this is a tempo based deck. You just want to be able to make sure you're on the board at all times, and the 3-drop weapon is more so for decks that want to stall. So I didn't really feel comfortable putting it in this deck, and there's not a lot of spells. But I think that this build of the deck is very, very good. Something to keep in mind about Marrow Manipulator and why it's in a lot of my tempo decks. If you end up fighting for the board and you're constantly clearing your opponent, this can literally be a 6-mana Pyroblast. If you have 5 corpses, you can easily deal 10 damage to the face. You could use it to keep your minions alive. It's a very flexible card, but in a tempo damage dealing deck, this is just absolutely perfect. This to help us draw combo. Like, there's just so many things about this deck that I feel like this is probably going to be one of the best tempo decks possible for Death Knight, because just being able to fight for the board, and maybe we could fit a Horde of Winter in here. I think there might be a reason for that, but I think the next deck actually goes more on some of the cheesier things that you can do with tempo and cheating mana. And yep, I was correct. As you can tell, this is very similar to the last list, but instead we have Queen Ashara as well as Horn of Winter. And this honestly does kind of change up the deck a little bit, because if you have several Horns of Winter, who knows what you can do with Brand School Teacher and all of that shenanigans. Like, we've already talked about that with Horn of Winter, but if you have even more mana cheating happening out of this, like, there's just a lot of things that this deck has potential of doing. And one thing that's also important to point out is that there's not a lot of counters available, so this might be the best fit for Okani if we're going to play him in Death Knight, if we're not just, you know, slapping him in a Renathal build. But everything about this deck I really like. I really like these two decks. They're kind of similar, but this deck's more on, like, it's just all about, you know, going all in on the early game, while this deck is more so, like, it can kind of spread itself out a little different. Like, there's, like, barely any, like, 3-4 card differences, but I think that you can kind of argue between the two different builds depending on what is relevant in the meta. And a lot of people are, you know, kind of skeptical on Horn of Winter, because it's like, you know, it's like Lightning Bloom, it's like Innervate, but regardless, one thing that I feel like people need to keep in mind about this card is that when you have Queen Ashara as a possibility, just having 0 mana cards just gives you the ridiculous consistency for cheating out either Colossal minions, or even I've even seen, I think I saw someone pick the weapon because of how many spells that they had. But imagine being able to legitimately pick the weapon out of Queen Ashara if you have, like, all of this damage ready to go. Like, it actually could be a very legitimate way to push even more damage than picking the ring, for example. The ring only gives you an additional 4. Like, there's a lot of potential with Queen Ashara in Death Knight, so I believe that if you're gonna run Queen Ashara, you have to run Horn of Winter. It's just absolutely necessary. Now let's stop talking about the Frost Runes, because good lord, I've already shown you a lot of decks with that, and I think there's a few more down the line, but I'm not going to explain them as much. This is going to be the unholy part, or the triple unholy part of this video, and I'll tell you right now, there are only so few ways I feel like we can win with this, but the decks kind of vary a little bit. One thing I will point out is that this is my very first build on the deck on how exactly we can try to make triple unholy really good, and my idea is that it's just a kind of an aggressive deck. You just want to play minions, and you just want to, you know, stick an anti-magic shell as early as you can, so that way Grave Strength, which is a ridiculous card by the way, can eventually end the game by just playing it on turn 4 through turn 6. I actually got a lot of pretty early lethals with this deck, and one thing that I definitely want to point out is Corpse Bride into Giants. This is like the high roll of the deck. It's kind of difficult to pop it off, but this is the thinking when I was building this deck. So in order to get Stitch Giant for 0, you have to discount, you have to get 10 corpses and somehow spend them. So if you play Plague Brain, or Plague Grains, if you play 2 of these as early as you can, and kill off a few extra minions, you can easily spend 2 corpses if you play the 3-drop. So this will spend 3 of your corpses in order to bring back another minion, and if that minion also dies, you don't really have to worry about this taking away from the corpse counters. So if you have the perfect curve and you play Grain into turn 3 Deathbringer, you can either on turn 4 with Coin, or on turn 5 just normally you can play Corpse Bride, and then you can play Double Giant. It's a very specific combo. It's a very specific set of cards to where if you don't hit exactly every single card, it's hard to do, but that high roll is still there. But regardless, like, even if you could do this consistently on turn 4, that's not the point. The point is, like, this is just a massive amount of stats to where if your opponent doesn't deal with it, suddenly Grave Strength turn these 8/8s into 11 attack minions, and that's just a lot of damage. And if you're constantly pressuring damage, that is not a lot. That is not a lot to end the game. Honestly, I don't even think Lord Marigar belongs in this deck, but it's just another way to utilize your corpses in case you don't get Corpse Bride into Giants. So that's why I put it in here. I'm not really 100% sold on it in this list. But regardless, if we're going to build an aggressive deck, I kind of like the idea of this. We're still running Embalmer to bring our minions back. We're still running Vizier in order to give us tons of value because we have plenty of undead minions, and cheating mana is still kind of good. But I think that this might be the best way to build Unholy due to the fact that it really is dependent on having board, and I'm just not sold on a lot of these other versions of the cards. Like, I don't like the mid-range version of the deck so far. If we have more Reborn minions, maybe we can make that happen. If we have a really sticky board if we have a deck list that comes up with like really sticky boards and suddenly Grave Strength is something you always have to worry about every turn, then I will consider it. But as of right now, it seems the best way in my mind is to just go all in on aggressiveness. And if we want to go all in on aggressive, I believe this might be a way to build the deck. As you can notice, we took out the more expensive cards and we're just all in on building a board and buffing it with Grave Strength. This is just probably going to be the go-to Death Knight deck for a lot of beginners just because it's a very straightforward deck. The cost of the deck is very inexpensive, and you're already gonna have this card in every single deck as is, so this is just going to be standard in every single deck, so people are just always going to have this card. So very inexpensive. It's still kind of like the same idea where you just go for tempo with Plague Grains, and then you can try to play the Giant as early as you can. But unfortunately in this deck there's not that many other ways in order to spend corpses. Like, you have the Necromancer, you have the 3-drop. I believe we took out we took out the 2-drop of this Bone Digger Geist. I'm not really too happy with this card and how it performs, so it might be a little bit difficult in order to get the Stitch Giant, but there's still possibilities of doing insane things just because you have Anti-Magic Shell and you have Grave Strength just cheating the games. Like, these cards are really important. One other card that I'm kind of hoping will be good, like, one thing I'm really focusing on with this deck is if you play turn 1 Body Bagger, or you coin out this and somehow have an undead minion, you play Body Bagger into Dark Transformation into Drakari Embalmer. That could be a pretty decent way in order to just guarantee yourself the board if your opponent doesn't have ways of dealing with the 4/5. But I think that this deck is very dependent on its early game curves, and if you do something like that, you might just seal out a lot of games or make it easier for a Grave Strength to work with, like, 3 or 4 minions instead of trying to fill up your entire board. But regardless, I think that this deck has a lot of potential. You have Astalor and the Brand in order to give you plenty of combos. This is just going to be this is going to be in almost every single deck. I hate to admit, Brand, School Teacher, Astalor. When you make several decks over the same class, you're going to, reuse a lot of the same things. But regardless, I believe that if you're going in for aggressive combos, this might be the way to go. Now we're starting to get into some of the decks that I'm not 100% confident about, but I decided, there might be some people that want to play the Scourge. There might be some people that want to play more of the wackier Unholy cards like Blightfang, like Malignant Horror is actually something that goes in several decks, but cards like Nerubian Swarmguard. Like, there's a lot of really interesting cards, and I didn't just want to just try to make the meta decks. I tried to make as many different decks as possible to where I even have a Rainbow Death Knight in here somewhere. There's not that many mixed rune decks, but they are still here. But this is an actual way to make this deck version of the deck somewhat viable, because it's kind of like the idea that I was saying earlier. If you can make a sticky deck to where you're always worried about Grave Strength ending the game, then this could be a very real way to start building the deck from now on. And the only reason why I don't like Scourge, by the way, I need to say this, the only reason I don't like Scourge is because of Bone Lord. If Bone Lord didn't exist and didn't act as like an automatic way for you to lose the game in 3 turns, I would probably put this in more decks, and especially if you can make this cheaper with like the Naga, for example, the 6-mana Naga, the Barbaric Sorcerer, I think it's called. But like, this card has a way of killing you, which is why I'm not a big fan of it. And it's also 9 mana, man, so you really need to hope that something good pops out of these. There's a lot of really bad undead minions too, so I'm just not sold on it. But like, cards like Army of the Dead, they're probably going to be pretty good. It's just I don't know how to accurately put this in my deck without like getting rid of the corpse count. And maybe you just want to use this with Stitch Giants, so that way you remove and play Giants. So that might be a synergy that I should have considered before recording this video, because I just now thought about that. But regardless, this might be a good way to make this more of a mid-range deck, kind of like what old Token Druid used to be with Whispering Whispers, or Whispering Woods, whatever that card was, some of the 1/1 cards based on how many spells you had, into Soul of the Forest. Like, Token Druid, that was all about like sticking a board and then killing you. that was the deck that I actually didn't mind as much as, like, versus, like, just going all in and then suddenly, oh, my board survived, I'm gonna buff it now. I am not a big fan of aggro druid, but this might feel more like the other token druids that we've had in Hearthstone's past. I gotta say, Blightfang is also a card I'm not too hopeful for, which is why it's not in my decks, because it's kind of dependent on you either being behind or both you and your opponent being at the same place. I kind of like cards that aren't always good. I don't like cards that are strictly better when I'm always behind, unless it's like an AoE or something, but this card just feels really weird to me. It might work. I am not hopeful for it, though. But regardless, if you're looking for something that's a little bit more down-to-earth on what might be possible out of the unholy attributes, or the unholy runes, I think that this might be a pretty decent deck to try out. One thing I do have to say, though, I am not 100% sure why the Swarm Guard is in here, outside of giving extra corpses, because we really don't have, like, Handbuff, for example. But it is also just another minion that gives minions. I just feel like this card is awkwardly statted, and unless you buff it, it's really bad. But maybe it's just good as a triple minion. But regardless, if you're trying to play a deck that's all about using the more fun cards in the unholy tribes, then this might be the deck for you. Next up, we have some of these mixed rune decks. Now, I'll go ahead and give this disclaimer before I get into all of these archetypes. I am not sure how good these mixed runes are going to be, in all honesty, and here's my main reasoning. A lot of these cards, and a lot of these decks are very dependent on very specific cards in order to be meta relevant. Like, for example, if you're playing Frost, you absolutely need your Lady Death Whisper in order to copy up your Frost cards in order to give you your lethal. If you're playing Unholy, you need the Plague Grains in order to give you the corpses automatically in order to make all of these cards that require corpses somewhat better. And in Blood, I'm gonna be honest, I really don't know what Blood is supposed to do. I don't have that many Blood decks, but I do have some. But my overall point is the triple Blood Rune cards really give the core of the deck the power that it needs to survive. So, like, these decks that like to mix things, it's very awkward to find cards that complement each other in that way. So I try to do the best that I could. I believe I have 4 or 5 decks that actually mix some runes, and this is the first idea. This is something that I might actually try on the first day, because I think that tempo might be able to go a long way. But let's go ahead and explain what's going on here. So I decided to combine the Frost runes with a Blood rune in order to go for maximum tempo, because my idea is, Queen Ashara, School Teacher, all of this is really busted, so you have to make rune for Horn of the Winter. But if we're running 2 Frost runes, what is the other card that we play? Do we play Blood, or do we go with Unholy? The reason I went for Blood is because we have cards like Soulbreaker, we have cards like the Cavalier that help us with the early game, and we also have Patchwork. Like, I really don't think this was the greatest way to build this deck if we're trying to go for tempo, but I'm really kind of stretching it here with combining some of these runes. But, like, I will say that this deck does have ways of being somewhat good, because if you can play for tempo, then you're constantly dealing damage, and you have high roll potential thanks to the Horn. So even though it seems kind of underwhelming because it doesn't have, like, these really big finishers, you have cards that are constantly finding you resources, like with the Nerubian, like with the School Teacher. You have constant damage being excreted. You have ways of being able to draw cards. You still have Defrost in order to give you consistent card draw as well. There's really a lot going on for this deck, and even in like the late game, if you're worried about like a bigger minion or something, or if you're worried about something in hand, you can still play Patchwork and get rid of like a Sire Denathrius or something in deck. So I think that this deck has potential, but this is where I'm really like on the fence, because like combining runes, some of these cards are good by themselves, but when you just put them into a deck, it feels kind of awkward, So let's go ahead and see what these other decks are, but just know that going into these other multiple rune decks, it gets a little dicey. Next up is an archetype I actually wanted to be really good when I first saw these cards, but I'm still kind of on the fence because, like, Blood Tap is a cool card and all, but you're running it. Okay, so like if you're running this in a Blood deck, in a triple Blood deck, it doesn't make a lot of sense because you have lots of cards that are aimed towards controlling and aimed towards gaining life. There's not really a lot of minions in these style of decks, and there are minions, but they're already pretty big. Like, this makes sense in like a more aggressive version of what Blood Death Knight can become. So this is why I feel like we had to include the Unholy rune for one of 2 reasons. We have the Nerubian Swarm Guard. that is a card that is absolutely necessary to make a deck like this work, due to the fact that it's literally the best copy card. Like, you do have Malignant Horror, you do have Twin Fin, and you do have like Pack Mules and stuff like that, so you have plenty of cards that can somehow get this high roll of Blood Tap. But like, this is just gonna be the nuts, man. If you can somehow play Blood Tap on turn 2, turn 3 into the Nerubian Swarm Guard, that is, let's see, +2/+2, that is 3 5s. That is 3 5s. 9-15 in stats on turn 4. That is a lot of stats. So I think that might be the cool reason to go for something like this. However, there is another version of this deck which actually goes into the reason why we have this Unholy Rune. But the Unholy Rune is just literally for the Nerubian Swarm Guard. And again, showcasing why combining these runes are very difficult, because you're literally combining these runes for like 1 to 4 cards, maybe 4 cards if you're lucky. So this is just really awkward synergy to do, and I have another way of trying to make this deck work. But instead, we are 2 Unholy and 1 Blood. So in this deck, I had to take out the board. I had to take out the Handbuff card. So again, we are showcasing the reason why combining these runes can be very, very difficult. However, the reason why I wanted to be able to do this is because we are running these cards. We're running the Unholy cards that actually can summon board, which makes sense. We want the board. We want to be able to go wide. And so that way, when we play our bigger minions, like, we just absolutely dominate. And one synergy I really want to point out here, I was not really sold on Overlord Runthak. In fact, this is a deck that I saw in my Discord that I actually updated a little bit. But something that I will point out is that if you have Overlord Runthak with Unholy Frenzy, that is a really powerful combo. Like, in all honesty, like, think about it. Runthak can attack, and then you can play Unholy Frenzy, he can attack again, and then he gets resummoned with Rush, so he can attack again 3 times. If you somehow tempo this card on turn 4 and it survives, you can get +4/+4 and buffs. What? That is insane. That is absolutely insane. I will point out that my Discord server had this in the deck, but they did not have Unholy Frenzy, and I absolutely had to include it for that reason. But something else to keep in mind about Unholy Frenzy, if your minions are buffed, they will resummon with their natural stats. That's fine, you're getting extra minions. Some of these minions are fine to bring back and get extra death rattles and whatnot. But regardless, this deck is all in on being able to make some really big minions. You're still running Soulbreaker as like your one really good blood card, because you absolutely need the corpses. You need the corpses to make the Nerubian Swamp, the Malignant Horrors really busted. If this card can somehow start steamrolling a game, then buffing this is going to be very, very real. Like, a lot of these cards are hard to judge because you look at a 2/4 for 4 mana and Reborn, like, it just doesn't look that good. But when you buff this card, trust me, it's worth it. You have Ram Commanders, you have the Vicious Bloodworm, and the Dark Fallen Neophytes in order to give this deck some kind of beef, so that way you're constantly trying to buff it. You even have Gnome Munchers for a little bit of lifesteal. Yeah, it's also just direct damage to a degree. If you could somehow have this go face, that's great, but it's probably just going to trade into minions, keep your board alive. But yeah, I would say that this deck has potential, but I don't believe in it, unfortunately. So if you're going to try out this deck, try it with caution. And the last mixed rune deck that we have is going to be 1 Blood, double Frost. And I'm sorry to anybody that was expecting a Rainbow Death Knight deck. It's really hard to combine those cards. I tried. I really did try. I even tried to make a runeless Death Knight, but you're pretty much just asking to play neutral cards and all of the basic Death Knight cards. So I just don't believe those decks are going to be any good. But regardless, if you're going to make this deck work, I believe this is actually a very gimmicky combo deck, and a lot of people put this on my giveaway on my giveaway tweet when I was asking for deck codes. I think this was the first deck posted, so a lot of people just stole it. But what is going on here is that we have a very, very low curve, so that way we can eventually play everything all in one turn. So the combo is, I don't know exactly how we're setting this up, but these are the cards that would make this happen. You have Stormpike Quartermaster to give a random minion in your hand +1/+1. As you can notice, the only minion that we have is Gnome Muncher. But the other minions that we have are Blood Mage as well as Death Chiller. Death Chiller is actually like a card that I thought would be massively busted, and this is the only deck that I have it in. So it's like, what happened? Why is this card not good? Well, we can't make copies of it. We really don't have that many ways of generating spells. And even if we do generate spells, dealing 2 damage is not really worth it. Even if you have both of these on the field, like, dealing 4 damage per spell, I don't think is as powerful when you literally need both of these in order to make that happen. Like, everyone was saying Flame Waker. Yeah, Flame Waker was good and all, but Mage also has ridiculous ways of making sure all of its spells cost 0. Death Knight doesn't have nearly that many ways of being able to make that happen, but essentially the combo... Sorry that I got sidetracked. The combo is you play Stormpike Quartermaster with your Death Chiller, so that way every time you play a spell, you're giving the Gnome Muncher +1/+1, plus you're dealing 2 damage. You have other cards that help you deal damage. You have Obliterate, you have Glacial Advance, you even have the weapon in order to help you discount some of these spells, so that way you can try to make them 0 mana, even though that is a weakness of the deck. But who knows, man, with Horn of the Winter, this deck could be actually somewhat relevant. If this is like the go-to Death Knight card, then this is why Frost Rune is just going to be the best, because it's got the Innervate. But this is a very gimmicky deck. I don't know how it keeps itself alive outside of just, you know, trying to draw and trying to stall. But you only have, like, Howling Blast. You're not even running... You can't run the Frost AoE. So, again, combining runes seems to be very weak because the most powerful things in Death Knight are within the triple rune cards. So if these tempo decks have a chance of competing with Prince Renathal, then maybe we might be able to see some of these archetypes emerge. But I'm really of the assumption right now that the only real way to play Death Knight, as of before the class actually gets released, I know that's really saying a lot, I really believe that the triple runes are going to be the way to go. These decks might have a chance, but I am not sold on them. Oh, wait a minute, guys. I lied to you. There's actually one more deck that has multiple runes that we need to take a look at real quick. And let me just fix this live because I'm too lazy to do anything else about it. But yeah, before you guys laugh at me, I pulled off this combo. I pulled it off. So if you guys are laughing right now saying that this combo will never work, Clark HELLSCREAM, I did it on my first game. My first game, I popped off the combo. And you can too if you believe hard enough in it. Essentially, what this deck is trying to do, in case you guys haven't seen the video I've made about this deck already, is we can combine Elwynn Boar with Unholy Frenzy. And if we can somehow... There's a couple ways of doing this. We can play Elwynn Boar into Bran Zola in order to give us 3 Boars, and then you can play Boar into double Unholy Frenzy to get the sword, or you can use the Queen Ashara ring in order to give you a 1-mana copy of Holy Frenzy. And there are some ways of being able to make it where, like, you just play double Boar to double Unholy Frenzy, but you still would need to clear them off anyway. And the only way to even make that happen is if the sword discounts the Frenzy. So there's actually a few versatile ways that you can pop off this combo, but it's not worth the stress. It's not worth the effort. And really, I'll tell you right now, the most powerful thing that I've done in this deck, and I've talked about this combo a lot throughout the entire video, I won a game on turn 5, turn 6, because I played Bran into double Horn, into School Teacher, into Coin the Noggling, and I just had so much board to where my opponent could not stop me. And then I played a Queen. And then I played a Queen for value. This deck has potential, but it's not because of the Boar, in all honesty. But I will say that this deck enlightened me to the possibilities of what Horn of Winter can do. It's not just a combo card, it could be a tempo card too. Don't forget that. Don't forget that these 0-mana cards are not just combo cards. They can be used for tempo. But if you're looking for a meme deck, this is 100% a meme deck. But I would say that this is probably going to be the most fun deck that you can play, not the most meta relevant. But regardless, if you're looking for a way to make Elwynn Boar work in Death Knight, I believe this is one of the only possible ways. Next up, we've got 2 different decks right here, and I'm not going to spend too much time talking about them because these are Meati's decks. But I'm just going to tell you guys right now, I struggled to figure out what is good in the Blood Death Knight class. And the only reason why I'm struggling with it is because I feel like out of all of the other Death Knights, this one, in order to build it, is very dependent on the meta that is surrounding it. So you do have the typical Meati Frost, the triple Frost Sire and Athrea's deck. A lot of people have seen this already. If you saw the Death Knight showcase, this is, I believe, literally card for card, the exact same list that he was playing. However, with Blood Death Knight, I believe things are a little bit different here. And the reason why I just really didn't want to make a list is because I don't know what the meta is going to be. And my problem with Blood Death Knight is that it doesn't have an actual, like, win condition. It has ways of stopping your opponent from winning, but it itself doesn't have a win condition unless you include the 7-drop that deals 3 damage every single turn to your opponent. It does technically put them on a clock, but if you're fighting anybody with healing, then that's not really a win con. Like, your win con would be Sire Denathrius here, right? So, unfortunately, like, that was my line of thinking when it came to the Blood Death Knight class, is that there's not a lot of ways of being able to build it. It's very dependent on the meta, and I do not like the idea of trying to foresee the meta and then make a deck surrounding it. So I believe that Triple Blood Knight definitely does have a place in Standard, but unfortunately, as of right now, as of before the class, I am not a good resource for that. So this is why we have the Death Knight Discord, in order to gather people's opinions, so that way I can actually try to inform people on what we can do with this, but as of right now, I just can't. So regardless, I believe that this does have a lot of potential, but I would only suggest this deck right now as the Triple Blood Knight deck, because it did have troubles during the Theorycraft streams. It did have troubles during the showdowns. However, I will give a spoiler. Wild Blood Knight looks really good. And we'll go ahead and take a look at those decks a little bit later, but I think we still have some standard decks. But if you wanted to play one of the Meatman's decks, here they are right here. The codes will be down below in case you guys want to try them out. And now it is time to start talking about some of the wild decks that we have on this list, because I'll tell you right now, Death Knight in Wild is actually a lot more powerful than I would give it credit for. Case in point, this deck right here is actually the best deck that I had while playing Wild. I think it had the highest win rate, but I wasn't really playing that many competitively relevant decks. I was playing a lot of memes, but in terms of like just trying to make Death Knight work, this actually felt like really, really good. This is kind of similar to like the Corpse Bride Stitch Giants combo that I referenced in Standard, but you do have a few wild cards that you could fit into this list. I'll give you a spoiler alert right now. In Wild, Death Knight is very dependent on its actual class cards, because unfortunately in Wild, the only cards you have to pull from are neutrals, and there are not that many neutrals that really make a lot of ground in Demon Hunter, unfortunately. So I really just slapped Loatheb and put in the Pirates package in here in order to make sure that maybe Anti-Magic Shell would be maybe always playable on turn 3, depending if you have it in hand. But I'm just really worried about Wild Death Knight in particular, because it's super dependent on the on the meta around it, and it has the least cards to pull from. So its cards really need to be really good. However, I will say that Blood Death Knight was performing mind-blowingly well, according to the players in Wild that were trying it, and I will have their videos here in a second. In fact, Zeddy had a deck he did really well with in the Blood Death Knight, to where he said apparently it was his favorite deck, and I think this is also his best deck. There was somebody else, Martian Boo, Blood Death Knight unbeatable. So there might be a way. You guys can't see it. I'll make sure to put these videos in the link description below. But regardless, there are ways to make Blood Death Knight work. But I would say that if you're trying to make Unholy work, this might be the only way to make it work. Just going all in on aggro. Like, I really don't see cards like Scourge, cards like, honestly, Lord Marrowgar. I don't know if they're going to be that good either. But in Wild, things are a lot faster, so you need to be able to kill your opponent quickly, or you need your late game to be impressive. And unfortunately, Unholy's late game is not impressive, but its early game definitely is. So if it's going to be relevant in Wild at all, I believe you have to go all in on aggro. Now let's take a look at some of the triple blood decks, because unfortunately I just did not have, I just couldn't figure out how to build them, man. Like, this is so weird, because I don't just want to put Prince Renathal and Sire Denathrius in every single deck, but I just can't figure out a different way to play this. Like, remember the Bone Lord idea that I had, where you want to try and go double Bone Lord, you want to play Bone Lord into Bran, Kael'thas, into Sire Denathrius and all of that? That might be a legitimate way to build that in Standard, but in Wild, you have so many ways of being able to keep yourself alive, to where 60 life is very impressive. So the entire list will be down in the description below, but generally this deck is just geared towards, you know, playing Vampiric Blood and then trying to keep itself alive. Zeddy also put Enchanter in this deck, which I think is kind of interesting. It doesn't really have a lot of damage cards, but if you do happen to run it with like Blood Boil, for example, that is 4 healing per minion that you get, so that could be somewhat impressive. There's a lot of healing, there's a lot of defense, and there's a lot of removal in this deck. So it's kind of hard to, let me see if I can't scroll up here a little bit. And yeah, there we go. There's the early game. It's just really difficult. It's just really difficult with this deck to do its own thing without playing into your opponent. But you do have Discover cards. You do have ways of sticking some minions. And you do have minions like Gnome Muncher, as well as the Legendary card to give you some amount of beef. And you also do have, like, you know, like Patchwork, Mutanus, oh, okay, apparently he doesn't have Mutanus in this deck, but you still do have, like, Disruption that is possible. It's just, I keep talking so bad about it, even though people are having good experiences with it, but I can't predict it because I don't know what we're going to be playing into. And if control is actually good going into the next meta, then this will have some potential. But if it's not, then it's really going to struggle. So I would say trust Zeddy, trust Martian Boo if they're telling you that this deck is good in Wild, because I didn't see it, unfortunately. I didn't go up against it during the Theorycraft stream, and I definitely didn't play it. So just take my advice, check out their videos, see what they have to say about it, and then maybe they can tell you something that I don't know. Next up, we have the Martian Boo video, but unfortunately, I cannot look at this, so I just had to make the deck over here, and I'll tell you right now, it is very juicy. We've got Reno cards in this deck. That's right, we got a Reno Blood deck, and a lot of you were probably not expecting that at all, as I am struggling to get this thing up here, but there we go. There we go. We've got actual Reno cards. We've got the Zephyrs, we've got the Reno, and we do have the Dragon Queen Alexstrasza. And I will go ahead and spoil the first game in the video that Martian posted with this deck. Apparently, Dragon Queen Alexstrasza is still pretty freaking good if you get lucky enough. Regardless, like, the thing I really like about this deck is honestly the curve. Like, for a Reno deck, this curve is really looking impressive to where you can play cards every single turn, and you're not just playing a freaking control deck. Like, you're actually playing a deck that can sometimes do something outside of just controlling your opponent. That's my biggest problem with this, as I've said many times. Blood Death Knight is super dependent on the meta that's surrounding it. But you still do have ways of being able to just play minions. You have, you know, Astalar, every single deck. He's just going in every single deck. He's literally that good. He's a Dr. Boom of our time. We have cards of Discover Blood runes. We have the Vampiric Blood. You can find another one. There's just really not a lot of specific things to say about this deck outside of the fact that it has a lot of Discover. And I feel like that's a lot of people's line of thinking. With Discover cards in Death Knight, you're more likely to get the cards that you want, especially if you're pulling from, like, Blood, if you're pulling from Frost, you're pulling from Unholy. But when you're pulling from Death Knight as a whole, it's a little bit interesting because you might be able to, as a triple Frost deck, find the triple Blood deck, or as a triple Blood deck, find the triple Frost card. Like, finding the Frostworm Freeze card out of this would be really freaking good, to the point where even Pandaren Importer is in this deck. Like, that just, you know, makes a Discover even more consistent. Something else about this deck, Arcane Dynamo. Why on earth would we play Arcane Dynamo? Well, if I remember correctly, the only spells that are above 5 mana or more are literally Blood Boil, Corpse Explosion, as well as the Scourge. In fact, let me go ahead and confirm this information right now, so I'm just not lying to you, fine ladies and gentlemen. Boom, boom. And, yeah, those are literally the only 3 cards above. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. There's also Army of the Dead. Okay, so you literally have 3 out of 4 cards you can pull, and one of them is literally unplayable, but the other 3 are very, very good. So, that, case in point, Discover in Death Knight is very powerful to where even in Wild, people are putting in cards like this because of how specific of cards that you can get. So, if you're wanting to play Blood Knight, I believe this might be the most fun way of doing it because it plays Reno. But Martian Boo apparently had he said it was unbeatable. I didn't watch the entire video. I don't think every single video has a win, but if every single video has a win, freaking this deck could be somewhat meta relevant. I don't know. But Blood Death Knight is going to be in the hands of more capable players because as of right now, I just could not figure out how to break it. But you want to know what I did break? I broke Raffle. And I broke him with this deck. In fact, there's a video that you guys can watch about it in my down in the description below if you haven't already seen this. I had literally the perfect game with this deck. Do I think this deck is good? Absolutely not. This is going to be a fun deck that you are going to play because it's, I think, literally the only way to kill off Mecha'thun in the Death Knight class. So what exactly is this deck aiming to do? You honestly just watch the video because it has a perfect step-by-step guide on how to pop off the combo. But the goal is to play Hemet as soon as you can, so that way all you're left with are Corpse Explosion, Bone Lord, Frost Whisper, as well as Mecha'thun. If you're worried about potential like devolves or silences, you have Obliterate in the deck. So you have Obliterate to actually kill off the Bone Lord, but you could also use Obliterate to kill off the Mecha'thun itself, depending on how the game progresses. So just, you know, don't play your Hemet if you still need the Obliterate. But you also have Mailbox Dancers in order to help you ramp up the Hemet turn. And actually, I ended up having a Mailbox Dancer on coin. So in my game against Raffle, I played this on turn 4, and his face was priceless. But regardless, whole point of this deck is just to play Bone Lord into Mecha'thun for 0, and then play Corpse Explosion with either 10 corpses on the field, or with 10 corpses stored up, or to use Obliterate. This deck is very straightforward. It's probably not the best version of the deck, but you have to keep cards lower than 3 mana. So I just pretty much put cards that either added corpses, dealt damage, or interacted with the board of some kind, or kept me alive. This deck is not good. This deck is a meme. Definitely play it because you want to have fun. But the fact that I was able to beat Raffle with it, ugh, it was super satisfying. And last and probably least is actually Even Death Knight. Although the reason why I have it on this list is because I hear a lot of people talking about it. I personally don't believe in it, as I just said, but this deck does have some gimmicky things on here, so I couldn't not include it, especially when, like, I have Mecha'thun Death Knight on this list. But one thing I really wish that was going for this list was, like, more giants. I wish we could somehow make this the giant Death Knight. But I don't really think that that's going to be that good because in Wild, people don't go too wide on the board. And even if they do, they're not letting you keep your minions. So regardless, what is this deck trying to do? It's trying to use the 1 mana version of the hero power in order to charge up minions. And it's also just like a way of dealing 1 mana, 1 damage and attacking and, you know, synergizing with the deck. You have ways of being able to discover unholy cards. I don't really know if you can do this in Frost or in Blood, or if you even want to. So if you're going to play Even, you're going to have to play Unholy because it's the only archetype that supports tokens dying. Maybe you could even find a way to fit in freaking Sire Denathrius in this, but I feel like that's just bad in an aggro deck. Although you do have lots of minions dying, so that's the only reason why I even said it. But regardless, maybe you could put in like Bone Lord into Sire Denathrius if you really wanted to. I'm trying to figure out a different way of building this deck because like cards like Knife Juggler, I'm not really too much of a fan of. Recombobulator, I'm not really certain unless it's trying to high roll with the 4-drop or something. Like this archetype is very fickle. It's very weak if it doesn't do what it wants to do in the early game, and its early game is literally playing hero power on turn 1. I'm not too confident in this deck, but who knows? There might be a version of Even Death Knight, but I saw at least 2 different people playing this during the Theorycraft stream. So there might be some potential for this deck, but unfortunately, I just can't figure it out. But there you guys have it. That is 20 different Death Knight decks that are possible. And even if these aren't decks that you're going to play, I hope I at least inspired you to come up with your own Death Knight deck and maybe to use some of these card packages that I suggested, because I really did do a lot of looking into the Death Knight class. I would say that this was the most work that I've ever done before an expansion to get hyped for it and to also familiarize myself with it. But when you're literally telling yourself you're only playing Death Knight, you got to make sure that you got to make sure that day 1 that you are absolutely just booking it. I want to be the first person to get 1,000 wins, and I'm gonna have to make sure that I start immediately. So guys, thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. I really hope one of these decks will help you explore the Death Knight class to some degree. Hopefully you'll be able to enjoy the decks that come out because I'm super excited for this class. It's going to be my favorite class, and I'm going to be the first person to get 1,000 wins with it. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. We'll see you for the next one.